After 15 years of long-haul truck driving, Danny Martinez still double-checks his logs before bed because of something he experienced. He was traveling Interstate 40 from Detroit to Phoenix in November 2019 with a load of auto parts. Outside of Amarillo, Texas, the weather had gotten bad, so he had to spend the night in a truck stop. With the exception of a few rigs strewn about in the rear lot, the Flying J was almost deserted. Danny parked his Peterbilt away from the lights of the main building in a corner. Even though he had run this route numerous times and was familiar with all the stops, something felt off that night. With the exception of sporadic bursts of static, the regular chatter on the CB radio had subsided to an unsettling calm. Approximately 2 in the morning. Danny's CB crackled to life as he was getting ready for sleep. A clear, calm voice could be heard. "The blue Peterbilt spot 47 driver. You must go now." With a racing heart, Danny sat up. He was in position 47 and his truck was blue. He reached for his CB phone. "Who is this? How are you aware of my parking location?" "Quiet. Then a man is approaching your truck. Something is in his hand. Turn on your engine." Nothing was visible in the darkness when Danny looked through his curtains. There was no one in the parking lot. "I see no one." "Who are you?" "Examine the mirror on the passenger side. 3 positions. Down, he is crouching behind the red Freightliner." Danny's heart froze. Yes, that was the exact location of a red Freightliner. A flash of movement grabbed his eye as he adjusted his mirror. Behind the other truck, a shadowy figure crouched. Something metallic seemed to be in the person's hand, glinting in the far light. The voice came back. "He has spent 20 minutes observing you. The police are out for 15 minutes. You must go to the front of the building's truck stop." Danny started his engine with trembling hands. In the still night, the diesel roared to life. He saw the person rise and make his way swiftly toward the structure as he started to move, vanishing into the darkness. He dialed 911 after pulling to the front of the truck stop. A crowbar was discovered beside the red Freightliner, and tire traces and footprints were discovered surrounding his initial parking location when the cops arrived. The owner of the truck was asleep inside the building and was unaware that his rig was being used as cover. However, this is where the narrative really horrifying. The cops examined the CCTV footage and CB radio files from the truck stop. During that time, there was no documentation of anyone using the CB frequencies. There was no other CB radio user in the vicinity, but the security cameras captured Danny's truck, the strange guy, and the abandoned crowbar. Danny stayed overnight in the parking lot of the truck stop, encircled by other motorists who had learned of the tragedy. He kept trying to call the enigmatic voice that had alerted him, but all he received was static. He told similar accounts to a number of senior truckers he spoke with the next morning. There were voices on the CB who should not have known, life-saving warnings, conversations that were unable to outline. Danny was informed by one driver, Mike Kowalski, of an event that occurred at 201 Bakersfield, California. A voice informed Mike that there was a multi-car collision up ahead while he was traveling in thick fog. He was led to a secure exit by the voice, but no other CB-equipped individuals were in the vicinity when the highway patrol came. It was a true accident. Because of the warning, Mike stayed clear of the 5 cars that had collided in the fog. In 2018, Sarah Chen, another truck driver, described a similar incident in Montana. She had heard a voice alerting her to a bridge washout on a distant roadway during a storm. Authorities learned that the bridge had actually collapsed a few hours prior when she turned around and reported it. However, there was no known source for the voice that saved her life. Over the past 10 years, the FBI's behavioral analysis team has documented dozens of these cases. These are referred to as phantom transmissions, CB radio warnings that seem to arrive out of nowhere but actually contain information that can save lives. All of the situations have certain things in common: remote truck drivers, perilous circumstances, and enigmatic voices that possess information they shouldn't. Despite finishing his sprint to Phoenix, Danny was troubled by the incident. In pursuit of answers, he studied CB radio technology. In some meteorological circumstances, skip propagation can make distant signals reach hundreds of miles. However, that doesn't explain how the voice was able to pinpoint his precise location and the specifics of his environment. In an attempt to learn more, he reached out to the truck stop management. They informed him of the 2003 murder of longtime truck driver Tom Brennan in the same parking area. Brennan has a reputation for lending a hand to other drivers, frequently using his resume to alert others to potential dangers on the road. His body was discovered close to spot 47. He had been killed during a robbery attempt. After 12 years of employment, Janet Rodriguez, the truck stop manager, recalled at least 6 such events. Every time an untraceable CB transmission alerted a lone trucker to an imminent danger. The warning was accurate each time. Every time the threat passed, the voice vanished. Danny attempted to explain what had transpired. Perhaps he had been cautioned by another driver who had spotted the odd guy. Perhaps anything was overlooked by the police throughout their inquiry. However, the proof was unmistakable. There was nobody else. Nothing else. Transmissions over the CB were recorded. But he got precise, detailed information that saved his life. The encounter altered Danny's approach to his work. He pays closer attention to his surroundings and is more wary about remote truck stops. However, he also pays more attention to his CB radio in the hopes of hearing that voice once more. He feels that someone or something is keeping an eye out for truckers on American roadways, not because he wants to be in danger. The case is still open. Despite having unambiguous security footage, the individual with the crowbar was never recognized. The CB transmission's origin is still a mystery. Danny never parks in position 47 again, but he keeps on driving. Additionally, he occasionally questions whether Tom Brennan is still out there attempting to keep his fellow truckers safe late at night when the highways are deserted and the CB is silent. The voice on the CB radio turned into Danny's scariest experience. Traveling. It wasn't because of what it was, but rather because of what it was unable to convey. When Rick Donovan first saw her, he thought he was going crazy. He was transporting refrigerated items from Denver to Fort Worth via Highway 287 through the Texas Panhandle on a misty October night in 2018. The area between Amarillo and Wichita Falls is infamously barren, with only limitless prairie and sporadic ranch lights. Occasionally after dark, a tiny community will roll up its sidewalks. Having driven for 22 years, Rick took great satisfaction in maintaining his attention during the lengthy, boring drives. However, as he fought against exhaustion close to the small hamlet of Childress at 3 in the morning, he noticed something that caused him to reevaluate all he had assumed about the road. Using his headlights to illuminate himself while standing on the shoulder was a young lady wearing a white gown. She had what looked like a little bag and had long dark hair. She didn't have her thumb out, but as he drew closer, she was staring at his truck. Rick's immediate impulse was to assist. Being stranded on this isolated route is risky for anyone, but it's extremely deadly for a lady who is by herself at night. Something halted him as he began to slow down. In the dark, the woman's immaculate white clothing seemed to gleam. There were no other cars to be seen. There isn't a wrecked car on the shoulder. What had brought her there? And why, on this chilly October night, did she not have on a jacket? As Rick went by, he looked in his mirrors at her. The woman had disappeared entirely. Behind him, on the deserted roadway, there was no sign of her. Rick shook his head, blaming it on highway hypnosis, that perilous condition in which fatigued drivers begin to experience hallucinations. On long hauls, he had heard of truckers seeing things that weren't there. Determined to maintain his focus, he cranked up the radio and took an energy drink from his cooler. But she reappeared after 28 minutes. Same luggage, same woman, same white outfit. About 15 kilometers ahead of where he had initially seen her, she was now standing close to a mile sign. Heart thumping, Rick slammed on his brakes. He reached for his CB. Any northbound drivers on 287? You imitate. Big Rick in the blue Kenworth is this person. Does anyone else see the white-clad woman out here? A gruff voice answered after a few seconds of static filled the cab. Do you mean Sarah? Yes, for the past 15 years or more, she has been walking this highway. Driver, don't stop for her. Simply keep going. Do you mean 15 years? Who is Sarah? Local girl Sarah Mitchell. You're fresh to this path. Despite running this highway for more than 10 years, Rick had never heard this tale. Tell me, the voice went on. In 2003, she was on her way home for Christmas vacation as a college student. Around midnight, a car broke down somewhere between Childress and Quanah. Rather than remain in her car, she began to walk. 3 days later, the trucker located her. killed by freezing 10 kilometers away from the scene of her car's death. Since then, I've been seeing her. Rick's heart froze. He glanced ahead and spotted the woman once more, nearer the road this time. She turned and stared at him when his headlights struck her. Her eyes were filled with a deep melancholy that made Rick's stomach turn, and her face was pale, almost translucent. "But that's impossible," responds Rick over radio. "At this moment I can see her. She is authentic. Driver, is anything out here real? She's not among the living, though. She has been observed by most trucks who regularly run 287, a little more compared to others. On this stretch, she shows up when the weather is poor or when someone is having problems." Rick's fists gripped the steering wheel so firmly that his knuckles turned white as he drove past the woman once more. She was gone again in his reflection. He received just static when he attempted to contact the other driver on the CB. Rick made inquiries at a truck stop near Wichita Falls early the following morning. The elder drivers were familiar with the tale. Sarah Mitchell was real. Online, Rick discovered her obituary. An exposure on Highway 287 during a December blizzard in 2003 claimed the life of a 20-year-old Texas Tech student. She tried to walk to the closest town after her car's gas ran out rather than waiting for assistance. However, the sightings began as soon as she passed away and persisted for years. Along that section of roadway, many of drivers reported seeing a young woman dressed in white. Local police looked into the claims since they were so common, believing that someone was pulling practical jokes or that similar events were happening. Following pressure from trucking companies whose drivers continued to report the enigmatic hitchhiker, the Texas Department of Transportation even added more emergency call boxes along the route in 2009. Sightings continued unabated. Rick talked to Martha Hendress, a seasoned dispatcher who had spent 30 years working with local transportation companies. She documented the encounters of Sarah Mitchell informally. Since 2003, there have been more than 200 reports from various drivers. The interactions frequently occurred between midnight and 4 a.m., in inclement weather or amid other drivers' emergencies on that particular stretch of road. According to Martha, most drivers only encounter her once or twice, while some do so frequently. It appears as though she favors those who see her frequently. They claim that she is attempting to communicate with them. Rick refused to accept it. However, he ran the same path 3 weeks later and ran across Sarah once more. She was indicating a rest place up ahead this time, rather than merely standing on the shoulder. Following her gesture, Rick discovered a family inside a broken-down pickup truck, a man with 2 small children whose car broke down in almost cold conditions. Rick stayed with the family until a tow truck came after he called for assistance. Later, the father informed him that the kids were exhibiting symptoms of hypothermia and that they had been trapped for more than 2 hours. Their lives were likely saved by Rick's help. Over the ensuing months, the pattern persisted. Sarah was always pointing Rick in the direction of someone who was having problems. One motorcyclist had been involved in a ditch collision. The automobile of an elderly couple fell off the slippery road. A truck driver who was able to stop before passing out after suffering a heart attack. Rick, a motorist who frequently saw Sarah Mitchell, became one of Martha's regular seers. He discovered how to keep an eye out for her appearances and heed her advice. Word got out about his frequent sightings and rescues, and other truckers on the road started referring to him as Sarah's driver. There was a huge psychological cost. Rick began avoiding the route whenever he could, but regular runs on 2887 were necessary for his company's contracts. He thought about switching careers, but he came to the conclusion that Sarah appeared to utilize him as a means of assisting others. It felt like too much responsibility. Rick experienced his most unsettling experience to yet in 2020. In his headlights, Sarah reappeared, but this time she was pointing forward and shaking her arms wildly. Rick discovered a huge pileup of 3 cars that had recently happened and were obscured by fog. He had the ability to radio for help and administer first aid till the arrival of paramedics. His early action resulted in the survival of 5 individuals. But when he looked back that night for the first time, Sarah was still there. After waiting for the ambulances to arrive at the accident scene, she turned to Rick and gave him a nod before disappearing. Since then, he hasn't seen her. Although Rick continues to drive Highway 287, the sightings have ceased. Given that her warnings saved the lives of strangers traveling the same perilous path where she perished, he questions whether Sarah Mitchell has at last found peace. Or perhaps she continued her unending watch along the desolate section of Texas Highway, working through another driver. Sarah Mitchell's case is still unsolved. The sightings are attributed by skeptics to chance, suggestion, and exhaustion. Rick, however, is aware of what he saw. More significantly, he is aware of the lives that were spared as a result of those unfeasible meetings. The events that make you rethink the lines separating the possible from the impossible, between life and death, can occasionally be the most horrifying. Rick still keeps a close eye on the shoulder as he drives that section of Highway 26C7 on foggy evenings, hoping Sarah has found a place to sleep, but he is prepared to assist if she calls on him again. Even now, Jake Morrison won't travel through Nebraska at night. He has spent 2 years attempting to make sense of an event that almost destroyed his sanity. And what occurred to him on Interstate 80 in March 2021 defies every logical explanation he can think of. Over the course of his 18-year career, Jake had driven the trip hundreds of times while transporting electronics from Sacramento to Chicago. It was a clear day. He was traveling quickly through the vast Nebraska plains with little traffic. He began to feel sleepy at around 11 p.m., roughly 50 kilometers west of Grand Island, and made the decision to pull into the next rest area for a power nap. In his headlights, the Platte River rest station showed up just where it should have, a typical Nebraska Department of Transportation facility with all the facilities one would expect. Jake had pulled into the parking lot many of times before, yet something felt off. Even though it was late at night, the place appeared oddly calm. He walked to the restroom building after parking his Freightliner in the truck sector. Strange shadows were created on the concrete walls by the flickering fluorescent lights above. Jake noted that the vending machines were humming louder than usual, but the facility was empty, which was normal for this time of night. The sound of an electronic drone appeared to reverberate off the walls. Jake went back to his truck and had a 2-hour nap after using the facilities. He closed his eyes and set his alarm for 1 a.m., but there was no sleep. There was an underlying sound he couldn't place, like radio static or faraway voices, and the buzzing from the building seemed to get stronger, almost throbbing. Jake gave up trying to sleep at 12:45 a.m. and made the decision to go on to the next significant truck stop. After turning on his engine, he left the rest area and re-merged into I-80 heading east. As he sped back up to highway speed, the digital clock on his dashboard read 12:47 a.m. However, Jake observed the well-known blue sign, Platte River Rest Area, 1 mile away 15 minutes later. His heart skipped a beat. It was not doable. After leaving the rest area, he had been traveling east for more than 15 minutes. He couldn't possibly be going near that again. After stopping, Jake looked at his GPS. He was precisely where he should have been, some 65 kilometers east of the rest area, according to the equipment. However, the sign was authentic. Additionally, he could see the identical rest spot in front of him in his headlights. Left. Jake pulled back into the facility, fascinated but confused. Everything had the same appearance. The building, parking structure, and flashing lights are all the same. Now, however, there were other cars. A white vehicle, a motorcycle, and a red pickup truck were parked close to the structure. On his first stop, Jake had not spotted any of these cars. In search of someone who could explain what was going on, he made his way back to the building. He discovered 3 persons inside: a teenage rider examining a road map under the harsh fluorescent lights, a middle-aged woman purchasing coffee from a vending machine, and an elderly man washing his hands at the sink. Jake went over to the old man. "How long have you been here, if I may ask?" The man's eyes widened in confusion. "I don't know. I paused to take a break, but I'm having trouble finding the highway exit. I keep coming back here when I try to leave." The woman turned around after hearing it. "Both of you?" "It's been more than an hour since I tried to get back on the freeway. The on-ramp basically takes me in circles, even though my GPS keeps telling me I'm in the correct location." The motorcycle rider entered the discussion. "The same is true here. I've made 3 attempts to leave. I keep returning to this parking lot. This place seems to be refusing to let us leave." A shiver went down Jake's back. He looked at his phone. No signal. When the woman tried hers, the same thing happened. The old man claimed that as soon as he parked into the rest area, his cell phone died. "What time did you all arrive?" Jake inquired. "Around midnight," the woman answered. "Same here," the rider remarked. "Maybe 11:45. The old man gave a nod. Right before Jake glanced at his watch at midnight. 1:23 a.m. He should have been driving for more than half an hour after leaving this location the first time, based on his chronology. However, he found himself back where he had begun. surrounded by 3 others who also claimed to be caught in the same cycle. Together, they made the decision to depart. Accompanying one another in a convoy, the pickup, the sedan, the motorcycle, and Jake in his truck came next. After driving toward the on-ramp and merging onto what looked to be I-80 eastbound, they saw the same blue sign, Platte River Rest Area, 1 mile away, precisely 12 minutes later. Jake didn't stop this time. The roadway ahead just ended in darkness as he passed the exit. No road closure, no construction barriers, just complete darkness where the pavement ought to be. Glancing in his mirrors, Jake applied the brakes hard. Behind him, the other cars had come to a standstill, their headlights shining on nothing but darkness. The caravan was forced to turn around and head back to the rest area. They all met in the building this time to talk about their predicament. Before retiring, the old guy, who identified himself as Henry, had worked as a long-haul truck driver for 40 years. Carol was a nurse who was on her way home from a seminar. David, the motorcyclist, was returning to school as a college student. They all agreed on the essential facts, but none could explain what was going on. Around midnight, they had arrived. Every time they tried to leave, they ended up back at the same rest location since their phones were not receiving any signal. The structures, although their watches appeared to be functioning regularly and the clocks had stopped at 11:59 p.m., time seemed warped. Thinking that daylight could break whatever was holding them, Henry proposed that they wait until morning. However, the sky stayed dark for hours. The time on Jake's watch was 4:30 a.m., yet no sign of sunrise could be seen in the distance. Under Jake's observation, Carol made a startling discovery around 5:15 a.m. She had been recording their experiences in writing, including the time of each escape attempt. Her notes indicated that they had attempted to depart on 17. Jake could recall only 5 or 6 attempts in the last 5 hours. Something even more disturbing was discovered by David. He had been using the camera on his phone to take pictures. With the exception of the GPS and cellular features, the device operated well. They displayed unthinkable visions when he showed them the pictures. The building for the rest area emerged. Distinct in every photograph, occasionally bigger, occasionally featuring distinct architectural elements, and occasionally featuring background people whom none of them could recall seeing. Panic was starting to set in by 6 in the morning. Henry proposed that they attempt to go in different directions. Perhaps the eastbound ramp was the only one impacted. David tried to drive cross-country through the prairie grass, and Carol tried the westbound entrance. Both made their way back in a matter of minutes, stating that their paths had inexplicably veered back toward the parking lot of the rest stop. Jake made the decision to try something new. He chose to continue walking to the edge of the rest area land rather than trying to exit by car. It seemed like he walked for kilometers, into the grasslands of Nebraska. However, the rest area building seemed to be the same distance behind him as it had been when he had begun. Even though the walkout had taken a lot longer, he was back at the parking lot in a matter of minutes when he attempted to return. At 7:22 a.m., a change occurred. A solitary bar of signal appeared on Jake's phone as the humming from the skyscraper suddenly ceased. At the same time, all of the other tourists' devices returned to the internet. Their precise location on I-80 was displayed by Carol's GPS once it resumed functioning. Before whatever had imprisoned them could restart, they made the decision to depart right now. The highway proceeded as usual into the distance this time as they approached the on-ramp. After arriving to Grand Island without any problems, Jake's convoy split up at a truck stop, swapping contact details and pledging to keep in contact. Despite finishing his trek to Chicago, Jake was haunted by the experience. He discovered something unsettling when researching the Platte River Rest Place. For renovations, the facility had been closed. Between February 15th and March 30th, 2021, the Nebraska Department of Transportation claims that during Jake's experience on March 18th, the rest facility ought to have been totally inaccessible. He spoke with David and Carol, who acknowledged that they had experienced the same insight. Trucking companies were unable to locate Henry, and his phone number was deactivated. Henry seemed to have vanished from the world. Over the next few months, Jake passed the Platte River Rest Place multiple times, both during the day and at night. With consistent traffic and operational conveniences, the facility seemed typical, although he didn't go back there. Carol gave Jake a call in September 2021. While researching their story, She came across internet forum entries from other tourists who had described similar experiences at several rest areas throughout the Midwest. The narratives all have a similar structure: arrivals at night, technical issues, being unable to go, and running into other stranded travelers who were later untraceable. A report from 2019 detailing a same experience at the Platte River a terrifying journey through Montana in December 2020 taught Marcus Thompson to be afraid of his own rearview mirror. On America's most desolate highways, what began as a typical drive from Seattle to Minneapolis turned into a mental nightmare that continues to cause him to doubt reality. Marcus was battling a severe snowstorm on Interstate 94, close to the North Dakota border, while transporting medical supplies in his red Kenworth. There was almost no visibility, and he was moving slowly He was traveling at about 40 km/h when he saw headlights in his mirrors. Behind him, another truck had arrived at precisely the same speed as his. Marcus was initially relieved. It was basic sense to drive a convoy in inclement weather. On hazardous routes, truckers watch out for one another. The snow obscured his vision, but the truck behind him looked like a dark, cold Peterbilt. Marcus attempted to use CB Channel 19 to contact the driver. Behind me, a driver in the dark peeked. "You imitate?" "In the red Kenworth, this is Red Dog." No answer. Marcus made another attempt on Channel 17 and 21, but all he received was static. He wasn't overly worried. The radio of the other driver might have malfunctioned, or he was preoccupied with the dangerous road conditions. The Peterbilt remained precisely 50 meters behind Marcus for the next hour, never approaching or retreating. The truck behind Marcus slowed down as he slowed down for very rough sections of road. The Peterbilt matched Marcus's speed exactly when he accelerated a little. It was impressive, but somewhat unnerving, how committed the driver was to keeping that exact distance. Around 2 a.m., Marcus stopped at a truck stop close to Miles City to get coffee and fill up. He wanted a respite from the white-knuckle driving, and the storm was becoming worse. He looked for the Peterbilt in his mirrors as he entered the diesel lanes, anticipating seeing it. Go into the truck stop with him. There was no vehicle. Marcus glanced around the parking lot, wondering if the motorist was parking somewhere else or had used a different entry. The truck stop, however, was almost deserted. There were only a couple of automobiles close to the building, his Kenworth, and 2 other rigs parked far from the fuel island. After more than an hour of pursuing him, the shadowy Peterbilt had just disappeared. After filling up, Marcus walked inside for coffee and asked the clerk whether he had just seen another truck pull in. No more trucks had come in the last 2 hours, according to the young man behind the desk, who had a good view of the entire lot. Marcus went back to his truck and joined back onto I-94, confused but unfazed. Though visibility had somewhat improved, the storm was still very much in effect. The headlights reappeared in his mirrors 10 minutes after he left the truck stop. The same truck, the same following distance, and his driving in perfect coordination. Marcus was determined to get in touch this time. He signaled the truck behind him with his air horn, flashed his brake lights, and tried every CB channel. No answer. Regardless of Marcus's actions, the Peterbilt maintained the precise 50-meter distance while continuing its robotic following pattern. The storm started to calm as morning drew near, and Marcus was able to get a better look at the truck behind him. His blood froze at what he saw. The Peterbilt looked like it was in excellent shape. No ice on the windshield, no snow accumulation on the cab or trailer, and no road salt. Even though it had spent hours in the same blizzard that had left Marcus's truck covered in ice and grime, it appeared to have just drove off a dealer's lot. However, that wasn't the most unsettling aspect. There was no driver visible to Marcus. The taxi seemed deserted. No shadows behind the wheel. The driver's seat remained still. There is nothing that suggests a human presence. Nevertheless, the truck kept up its mechanically accurate pursuit of him, adapting to every shift in his direction and speed. At the following rest stop, Marcus parked with trembling hands. In his mirrors, he saw the Peterbilt come to a stop precisely 50 meters behind him on the shoulder. For 10 minutes, Marcus waited in his taxi to see whether the driver would come out of the enigmatic truck. Nothing. No one got out of the Peterbilt, which sat still with its engine going. Marcus, his boots crunching in the snow, picked up a flashlight and headed back toward the truck. He could see that the cab was really empty as he approached. No one could be seen in the sleeper, and the driver's seat was empty. But there were no indications of damage or malfunction. The truck's headlights were on, and the engine was running. Something unthinkable occurred as Marcus got to the passenger side and attempted to peer through the window. Despite the obvious absence of a driver, the vehicle started to move ahead slowly. As the Peterbilt re-entered the roadway and repositioned itself 50 meters behind his parked Kenworth, Marcus leaped back. Marcus dashed back to his truck and dialed 911, but there was no connection on his cell phone in the far-off place. In a desperate attempt to find a vehicle nearby, he used his CB radio. At last, a trucker some 30 kilometers ahead answered. On 94, here is Moondog heading east. Red Dog, go ahead. I need a favor from you, Moondog. I'm acting a driverless truck came next. I understand how that may seem, but as we pass your place, I need you to keep an eye out for us. About 50 meters behind a red Kenworth was a dark Peterbilt. Red Dog, copy that. I'll be watching. As soon as Marcus retreated into the highway, the Peterbilt started up again. Moondog's voice crackled over the CB 20 minutes later. Red Dog, your Kenworth is currently driving by where I am, but there isn't a truck behind you, brother. There are no other headlights in either direction, and your trailer is clear. Marcus anxiously looked in his mirrors. The Peterbilt remained, keeping its ideal following distance. Are you sure, Moondog? I'm currently examining it in my mirrors. I'm staring at you through my windshield, Red Dog. Out there, you're jogging alone. For long minutes, Moondog insisted that he only saw Marcus's truck, even though Marcus could plainly see the Peterbilt after him. To find out what was going on, they planned to meet at the next truck stop. Marcus parked into a parking spot at the truck stop and observed the Peterbilt park, which was 50 meters away in a vacant section of the lot. After a few minutes, Moondog arrived at the truck and proceeded to Marcus's vehicle. A terrifying journey through Montana in December 2020 taught Marcus Thompson to be afraid of his own rearview mirror. On America's most desolate highways, what began as a typical drive from Seattle to Minneapolis turned into a mental nightmare that continues to cause him to doubt reality. Marcus was battling a severe snowstorm on Interstate 94, close to the North Dakota border, while transporting medical supplies in his red Kenworth. There was almost no visibility, and he was moving slowly He was traveling at about 40 km/h when he saw headlights in his mirrors. Behind him, another truck had arrived at precisely the same speed as his. Marcus was initially relieved. It was basic sense to drive a convoy in inclement weather. On hazardous routes, truckers watch out for one another. The snow obscured his vision, but the truck behind him looked like a dark, cold Peterbilt. Marcus attempted to use CB channel 19 to contact the driver. Behind me, a driver in the dark peeked. You imitate? In the red Kenworth, this is Red Dog. No answer. Marcus made another attempt on channels 17 and 21, but all he received was static. He wasn't overly worried. The radio of the other driver might have malfunctioned, or he was preoccupied with the dangerous road conditions. The Peterbilt remained precisely 50 meters behind Marcus for the next hour, never approaching or retreating. The truck behind Marcus slowed down as he slowed down for very rough sections of road. The Peterbilt matched Marcus's speed exactly when he accelerated a little. It was impressive, but somewhat unnerving, how committed the driver was to keeping that exact distance. Around 2 a.m., Marcus stopped at a truck stop close to Miles City to get coffee and fill up. He wanted a respite from the white-knuckle driving, and the storm was becoming worse. He looked for the Peterbilt in his mirrors as he entered the diesel lanes, anticipating seeing it. Go into the truck stop with him. There was no vehicle. Marcus glanced around the parking lot, wondering if the motorist was parking somewhere else or had used a different entry. The truck stop, however, was almost deserted. There were only a couple of automobiles close to the building, his Kenworth, and 2 other rigs parked far from the fuel island. After more than an hour of pursuing him, the shadowy Peterbilt had just disappeared. After filling up, Marcus walked inside for coffee and asked the clerk whether he had just seen another truck pull in. No more trucks had come in the last 2 hours, according to the young man behind the desk, who had a good view of the entire lot. Marcus went back to his truck and joined back onto I-94, confused but unfazed. Though visibility had somewhat improved, the storm was still very much in effect. The headlights reappeared in his mirrors 10 minutes after he left the truck stop. The same truck, the same following distance, and his driving in perfect coordination. Marcus was determined to get in touch this time. He signaled the truck behind him with his air horn, flashed his brake lights, and tried every CB channel. No answer. Regardless of Marcus's actions, the Peterbilt maintained the precise 50-meter distance while continuing its robotic following pattern. The The storm started to calm as morning drew near, and Marcus was able to get a better look at the truck behind him. His blood froze at what he saw. The Peterbilt looked like it was in excellent shape. No ice on the windshield, no snow accumulation on the cab or trailer, and no road salt. Even though it had spent hours in the same blizzard that had left Marcus's truck covered in ice and grime, it appeared to have just drove off a dealer's lot. However, that wasn't the most unsettling aspect. There was no driver visible to Marcus. The taxi seemed deserted. No shadows behind the wheel. The driver's seat remained still. There is nothing that suggests a human presence. Nevertheless, the truck kept up its mechanically accurate pursuit of him, adapting to every shift in his direction and speed. At the following rest stop, Marcus parked with trembling hands. In his mirrors, he saw the Peterbilt come to a stop precisely 50 meters behind him on the shoulder. For 10 minutes, Marcus waited in his taxi to see whether the driver would come out of the enigmatic truck. Nothing. No one got out of the Peterbilt, which sat still with its engine going. Marcus, his boots crunching in the snow, picked up a flashlight and headed back toward the truck. He could see that the cab was really empty as he approached. No one could be seen in the sleeper, and the driver's seat was empty. But there were no indications of damage or malfunction. The truck's headlights were on, and the engine was running. Something unthinkable occurred as Marcus got to the passenger side and attempted to peer through the window. Despite the obvious absence of a driver, the vehicle started to move ahead slowly. As the Peterbilt re-entered the roadway and repositioned itself 50 meters behind his parked Kenworth, Marcus leaped back. Marcus dashed back to his truck and dialed 911, but there was no connection on his cell phone in the far-off place. In a desperate attempt to find a vehicle nearby, he used his CB radio. At last, a trucker some 30 kilometers ahead answered. "On 94, here is Moondog heading east. Red Dog, go ahead. I need a favor from you, Moondog. I'm acting a driverless truck came next. I understand how that may seem, but as we pass your place, I need you to keep an eye out for us." About 50 meters behind a red Kenworth was a dark Peterbilt. "Red Dog, copy that." "I'll be watching." As soon as Marcus retreated into the highway, the Peterbilt started up again. Moondog's voice crackled over the CB 20 minutes later. "Red Dog, your Kenworth is currently driving by where I am, but there isn't a truck behind you, brother. There are no other headlights in either direction, and your trailer is clear." Marcus anxiously looked in his mirrors. The Peterbilt remained, keeping its ideal following distance. "Are you sure, Moondog?" "I'm currently examining it in my mirrors. I'm staring at you through my windshield, Red Dog. Out there, you're jogging alone." For long minutes, Moondog insisted that he only saw Marcus's truck, even though Marcus could plainly see the Peterbilt after him. To find out what was going on, they planned to meet at the next truck stop. Marcus parked into a parking spot at the truck stop and observed the Peterbilt park, which was 50 meters away in a vacant section of the lot. After a few minutes, Moondog arrived at the truck and proceeded to Marcus's vehicle. Tommy Vasquez believed that his night was the worst of his professional life when his GPS failed on a secluded section of Nevada's Highway 50. Everything he believed he knew about time, space, and the highways connecting America's most isolated locations was called into question by what he learned over the course of the following 8 hours. Tommy was traveling on what truckers refer to as the loneliest road in America in August 2019, as he transported construction equipment from Las Vegas to Denver. Highway 50 traverses hundreds of kilometers of nearly uninhabited Nevada desert. The horizon was nothing but mountains, sage scrub, and unending tarmac. Between Austin and Ellery, at approximately 11 p.m., Tommy's GPS screen went dark. Nothing worked, even after he tried rebooting the device, verifying connections, and even using his backup navigation system. With the exception of GPS, all of his technological devices appeared to be operating as intended. No satellite connection, no signal, nothing. At first, Tommy wasn't really worried. Knowing that the highway was essentially a straight shot with few bends or exits, he had driven this route numerous times. Using road signs and mile markers, he could find his way to the next town, where he could have his GPS fixed. However, Tommy started to notice an oddity with the mile markers as he drove eastward. He was heading toward Denver, and they were falling, not rising. Mile markers 127, 126, and 125 came next. Tommy assumed that he had somehow gotten lost and was inadvertently traveling west toward California. He paused and looked at his compass. It was obvious that the needle was pointing east. The mile markers were counting down, even though he was traveling in the right direction. 124, 123, 122. In his 23 years of driving, Tommy had never seen anything like it. Tommy attempted calling other drivers on his CB radio, but all he got was static. There was no reception on his cell phone, which was not unusual in this far-flung place. He made the decision to continue driving until he came to a town or located another truck so he could get directions. The mile marks continued their backward countdown for the following hour. Tommy went past markers 95, 85, and 70. He had traveled more than 60 kilometers, according to his odometer, but the markers indicated that he was traveling backwards rather than forwards through space. Tommy slammed on his brakes when he noticed something at mile marker 50. A middle-aged man wearing a job and holding a cardboard sign was a hitchhiker in his headlights. However, when Tommy approached, he saw that even though the man was directly in the truck's intense spotlights, he wasn't creating a shadow. Tommy's window was rolled down. "You need a ride, buddy?" The man's eyes seemed to reflect light like an animal's when he glanced up. "You're heading in the wrong direction," he remarked in a voice that seemed to be coming from a great distance. "Before you reach a mile, turn around. Marker 0. At mile marker 0, what takes place?" He gestured toward the roadway. "Though you won't be able to return, you'll see." The hitchhiker took a step back into the darkness and disappeared before Tommy could inquire what that meant. Tommy exited his truck and used his flashlight to look around, but he couldn't find the man. Around the highway, the desert was open and level. One could find no place to hide. Inquisitive yet terrified, Tommy drove on. Mile markers continued to count down. 30, 25, 35. In his headlights, each marking appeared to glow a little, as though it were internally illuminated. Tommy saw that the stars were brighter than usual and that the desert landscape appeared more vibrant and alive, as though he were viewing it through a different lens. Sort of bright. At mile marker 10, Tommy's truck started to have issues. His headlights flickered, the radio began to pick up odd interference, and the engine began to run rough. He heard what sounded like music from decades ago, mingled with persons speaking in languages he didn't identify. The speedometer needle started to erratically fluctuate, with speeds ranging from 0 to more than 150 kilometers per hour, despite the fact that Tommy was moving steadily. Tommy's sense of dread grew when he saw mile marker 5 in his headlights. He kept thinking about the hitchhiker's warning. "Before you get to mile marker 0, turn around." However, Tommy was an unyielding individual, and his curiosity triumphed over his dread. He must have known what took place at mile marker 0. A segment of highway that didn't appear like the others followed mile marker 3. The yellow lines seemed to sparkle with their own light, and the asphalt looked fresher, almost reflecting. Tommy's truck didn't feel like it was moving. It was hovering. The typical road noise and vibrations had vanished. Milestone. In an area of desert that appeared to belong on a different planet, I stood by myself. Tommy didn't identify the odd plants that had replaced the sagebrush. Additionally, it seemed as though the far mountains were moving and changing shape like living things. Tommy then noticed mile marker 0, made of what appeared to be black metal. It was bigger than the other markings, and instead of reflecting his headlights, it absorbed them. His truck started to slow down on its own as Tommy got closer, as though the engine was defying his orders. His car appeared to be drawn to the marker like a magnet. About 10 meters ahead of the marker, Tommy pulled over and stepped out of his truck to look around. He had never seen a marker like this before. Flawlessly smooth, free of installation hardware and manufacture blemishes. The metal appeared to have been engraved with the number 0. However, the wounds were so deep that they vanished into the night. Tommy heard the sound of cars approaching as he stood there. He saw something inconceivable, though, when he turned to face the roadway again. There was a truck convoy coming from the west, in the same direction as his origin. However, these trucks weren't up to date. They had the style and color schemes of cars from the 1950s and 1960s, giving them an authentic appearance. The lead truck arrived at Tommy's trailer and came to a stop. The driver, an old man dressed in classic truck attire, pulled down his window. "You picked a bad night to get lost, son," the elderly motorist remarked. "This section of road does not adhere to the same regulations as the remainder of the highway." "What are you saying?" Tommy inquired. "The line ends at mile marker 0. You'll be traveling in circles like us for eternity if you cross it. It doesn't operate the same way here, and we've been trying to find our way back to the real highway for a long time." The elderly driver pointed to his convoy's other vehicles. Since 1963, Jimmy has been a driver. Claims that on this same road, he was turned around while transporting livestock to Denver. Maria arrived in this place in the 1980s. She got off the main road due to a computer glitch. All of us are looking for our way home. Tommy glanced at the other vehicles and the people who drive them. Every car belonged to a different time period, and the drivers all shared the same hopeless, lost expression. They had spent decades, if not more, stuck on this impossibly long stretch of highway. "How do I get back to the real road?" Tommy inquired. "Turn around now before midnight," the elderly driver said. "The highway will reorganize itself after midnight, leaving you stranded here with us." Most people don't listen to the warnings we try to give. After passing mile marker 0, they vanish into whatever lies beyond. Tommy checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. He had 13 minutes to get away from whatever it was, taking place along this section of Highway 50. He hurried back to his truck after thanking the elderly motorist. Tommy saw that the mile marks had changed once more when he swung his rig around. As he headed west, they were counting down from a number so high he couldn't read it in the darkness, rather than counting up from 0. The roadway continued in both directions indefinitely, not meeting the horizon but vanishing into dark emptiness. As Tommy watched his clock tick off the minutes till midnight, he drove his pickup as fast as it would go. He crossed a mile sign that displayed the infinity symbol at 11:58. At 11:59, a marker with continuously shifting numbers was illuminated by his headlights, too quickly to read as it cycles through random digits. At precisely 12 in the morning, Tommy's truck abruptly returned to normal after crossing an imperceptible border. When his GPS briefly came back to life, it displayed his precise location on Highway 50. The mile markers went back to their regular eastward course. A truck stop dispatcher in Ellery sent a clear signal to his radio. Tommy arrived at he spent the remainder of the night investigating his experience at the first truck stop he came across. He found scores of accounts from drivers who had become lost on isolated sections of Highway 50, describing everything from GPS malfunctions to running across cars from different eras. Mile marker 0 was not on file with the Nevada Department of Transportation, and maps revealed no inconsistencies or holes in the highway numbering scheme. Tommy, however, discovered something else. Someone who is missing over the years. There have been instances of truckers who disappeared while traveling Highway 50. Drivers whose last known locations were halfway between Ellery and Austin, and whose trucks were never located. Their disappearance dates coincided with the times Tommy had seen the trucks in the Phantom Convoy. Tommy never drove Highway 50 by himself again, but he did finish his run to Denver. He always drove with another truck when he had to take that route, and he did so during the day. He made multiple attempts to locate mile marker 0, but he was never able to pinpoint the location of his encounter. Tommy occasionally ponders whether those lost drivers are still out there, stranded on an impossibly long road that lies between the mile markers of reality, while he is driving other desolate routes late at night. He also ponders what could have happened if he had continued on past mile marker 0 and entered whatever was on the other side of the most desolate road in America. Tommy learned from the experience that the numbers on mile markers don't always count in the expected direction, and that certain highways lead to places that aren't shown on any map. It is conceivable to drive off the end of the known world and find yourself on a highway that follows rules older and stranger than human comprehension amid the expanse of the American West, where routes stretch for hundreds of kilometers through desolate desert. During what should have been a typical overnight trip from Phoenix to Albuquerque in October 2020, Ray Kowalski learned that some highways exist in two places simultaneously. On America's interstate system, what began as a straightforward GPS error evolved into a nightmare that caused him to doubt reality itself. Ray had been transporting furniture and electronics between Arizona and New Mexico on the same stretch of Interstate 40 for 12 years. He was familiar with all the rest stops, truck stops, and landmarks along the route. He often took 8 hours to complete the 700-kilometer trip, including pauses for food and petrol. Around 2 a.m. on this particular night, Ray's GPS started acting strangely while he was traveling through the Arizona desert. The device showed 2 parallel freeways running side by side, rather than his location on I-40, while the other displayed the same highway running parallel to it around a kilometer to the south. The first displayed the icon of his truck traveling normally along the well-known path. Ray thought it might have been satellite interference or a mapping error, but as he drove further, He saw something unsettling in his side mirrors. In the distance, another roadway that ran parallel to I-40 could be seen. After hundreds of miles of driving, Rai had never seen a second roadway in that area. At the next rest stop, he stopped and used the binoculars he carried in his cab to examine the landscape. As expected, a highway with guardrails, mile signs, and what looked like traffic ran parallel to I-40. However, every map Ray had ever seen indicated that the area in question should be desert. Ray tried asking other cars about the enigmatic highway on his CB radio. However, the answers he received were unclear. While some drivers said they could see the parallel road, others insisted there wasn't one. The most peculiar aspect was that every driver who was able to see the duplicate highway claimed to have seen the same thing. The traffic on I-40 is traveling in the opposite direction. Rai was intrigued and a little uneasy, so he wanted to find out. He cautiously navigated his pickup over the arid landscape after spotting a dirt path that appeared to head toward the parallel roadway. After roughly 10 minutes of slow driving over a rougher-than-expected road, he came to what looked to be an on-ramp to the duplicate highway. The road surface appeared to be the same as that of I-40. The reflective paint, lane markers, and tarmac are all the same. The mile marks were identical to those on the main route. However, Ray realized something was amiss as soon as he turned onto this duplicate road. The direction of the traffic was incorrect. Ray was driving east into New Mexico while every car on the duplicate highway was heading west toward Arizona. Automobiles, motorbikes, and semi-trucks are all traveling in the wrong direction. However, when Ray looked at his compass, it was evident that he continued on his eastward journey. On the duplicating highway, Ray was able to get in touch with another trucker by trying his CB radio once more. The ensuing discussion was illogical. The white Freightliner's eastbound driver. The blue Peterbilt is Desert Rat. Where are you going? The response came, I'm heading to Denver. If the weather holds, it should be there by morning. Ray surveyed the area. There were no weather problems and the night was clear. What kind of weather? This place is clear. Clearly? It's the worst sandstorm I've seen in 20 years, brother. Can hardly see 50 meters ahead. About a quarter of a kilometer in front of him, Ray could clearly see the white Freightliner. The truck had excellent visibility and was traveling in broad moonlight. No sandstorm was in sight. Each motorist described entirely different weather conditions and locations as the conversation went on, despite the fact that they were purportedly on the same route. Ray's GPS showed both vehicles on a duplicate version of I-40 in Arizona, while the other driver maintained he was on I-25 going north through Colorado. Ray saw additional cars on the duplicate highway during the course of the following hour, and every discussion uncovered the same trend. Every driver thought they were on a different route, going to various places and dealing with varied weather, but Ray could see them all perfectly, following what seemed to be a perfect replica of I-40. Upon passing a rest spot on the replica highway, Ray made the most unsettling discovery. The buildings, parking arrangement, and signs were all the same as those at the Meteor Crater rest station on I-40. However, the rest area's patrons were different. Families, truckers, and tourists who appeared to be from many eras were visible to Ray. Some wore 1980s-style clothes, while others wore 1990s-style clothes. Their cars corresponded to the periods they appeared to be in. Vintage trucks, older automobile models, and even ones that Ray hadn't seen in decades. However, none of these vehicles or individuals seemed transparent or ghostly, but rather substantial and real. After parking at the replica rest area, Ray went over to a family packing their belongings into a 1987-style station wagon. They ignored him as if he didn't exist when he attempted to communicate with them. They couldn't see or hear him, but he could see them well and hear what they were saying. Ray recognized a trucker from the 1990s refilling a vehicle that had been out of production for 15 years. Ray attempted to speak with the driver but was unsuccessful. Even while Ray was standing, the man was unable to see or hear him. Adjacent to him, Ray became aware that he was in a parallel universe to the rest area, able to view individuals from many eras but unable to communicate with them. The ramifications were horrifying. Was he trapped in a time replica of I-40, witnessing the echoes of past travelers? In an attempt to locate the actual I-40, Ray went back to his truck and drove on the duplicate roadway. However, Each exit ramp he attempted either looped back to the same highway or led to an empty desert. 2 parallel routes were still displayed by his GPS, but Rai was now unable to distinguish between the duplicate and the genuine one. 500A. Rai came across something that almost drove him insane. He could see his own truck coming from the other direction in the distance. Not the same truck. His truck was identical in terms of model, paint job, and company emblems. Rai saw himself behind the wheel of the truck, appearing scared and bewildered as it drew closer. The replica Ray, who was traveling in the opposite way, seemed to be experiencing the same things as the real Ray. Both Rice looked at each other in disbelief as the trucks passed one another. The replica, with the same attire and even the same face of confused horror, Ray bore a striking resemblance to him. When Ray attempted to follow his counterpart, the truck vanished around a curb and was never seen again. He continued to drive for an additional hour, looking for a route off the duplicate highway or some indication of his other self. He was getting anxious as his gasoline gauge was getting low. Ray saw something that gave him hope just as the sun was starting to rise. "Return to I-40 next exit" is written on a sign. The exit ramp, which led off the duplicate highway and into what appeared to be the actual desert, looked normal. Ray didn't hesitate to get out. A gravel road that seemed to go on forever was reached by the ramp. After 20 minutes of driving over progressively rugged terrain, Ray eventually caught a glimpse of the recognizable landmarks of the actual I-40 in the distance. Upon arriving at the highway, his GPS instantly reverted to displaying only one road as he merged back into regular traffic. In Albuquerque, Ray finished his delivery, but his thoughts kept returning to the event. He looked into sightings of duplicate highways and discovered sporadic accounts of similar experiences from vehicles nationwide. The majority were written off as hallucinations brought on by illness or exhaustion. However, Ray discovered a thorough report from a driver in 2003 that documented an almost identical experience on Arizona's I-40. The driver claimed to have seen cars and people from past eras occupying a parallel highway, and he even experienced his own duplicate driving in the other direction. Over the next few months, Ray continued to drive the I-40 route dozens of times, constantly looking for indications of the duplicate roadway. He didn't see it again. However, he occasionally ponders whether there is another version of himself out there, still stuck on that impossibly similar road, attempting to find his way back to reality while driving across the Arizona desert late at night. The encounter showed Ray that the roadway system in America may be more intricate than most people realize. That some roads have several concurrent versions, each inhabited by people from various eras and locations. Additionally, there may be duplicates of every driver who has ever become lost in the expanse of the American Southwest on a roadway that resembles I-40, but isn't quite the same. Although Ray still travels large distances, he is more cautious when relying on his GPS and pays closer attention to the highways that parallel his path. Because occasionally, Ray discovered, there are other versions of the roadway you're driving on. Additionally, if you take the incorrect exit, you may end up on a route where you will encounter people going from the opposite direction. During a transport from Portland to Salt Lake City in September 2021, Brian Matthews discovered that some weigh stations measure more than simply the weight of your cargo. What transpired during a routine inspection check on Oregon's Interstate 84 altered his perception of what government. Actually, there are institutions that keep an eye on the roads in America. Due to construction delays near the Dallas, Brian was a little behind schedule when he hauled computer equipment in his silver Mack truck. Around 1000 p.m., he noticed the recognizable blue sign. Weigh Station 2 requires all commercial trucks to halt. Miles. Over the course of his 15-year career, Brian had passed through this specific weigh station numerous times and was familiar with the procedure. However, something appeared unusual when he got closer to the complex. Strange shadows were formed across the inspection bays by the dimmer-than-normal floodlights that normally illuminated the weigh station. The normally open or closed electronic indicators were entirely dark, indicating no information whatsoever. As he got closer to the scales, Brian slowed down and moved into the right lane. It looked like the weigh station was open. The building appeared older than he remembered, with equipment and signage that appeared to be at least 20 years out of date. Yet there were other vehicles ahead of him going through the inspection procedure. Brian was waved onto the scales by a uniformed officer. There was something strange about the man. even though he was dressed in what looked to be a typical Department of Transportation outfit. Even though it was late and Brian himself was clearly exhausted, his movements were too exact, almost robotic, and his face was expressionless. "Step out of your vehicle and bring your logbook and registration." With a monotonous voice, the officer gave instructions. Brian obeyed, taking his documents out of the taxi. He saw that all of the other vehicles passing through the weigh station were older models as he made his way to the inspection office. He hardly ever saw trucks from the 1990s and early 2000s anymore. Driving through the inspection process like sleepwalkers, the drivers appeared exhausted and disoriented. After being led to a counter in the inspection office, Brian's documents were examined by another officer. It appeared as though the office had not been renovated in many years. Filing cabinets that seemed like they belonged in a museum, fluorescent lights that fluctuated all the time, and old PCs with CRT monitors. "Why are you traveling?" Even though Brian's logbook made this information quite evident, the officer nevertheless asked. Brian answered, "I'm delivering computer equipment to Salt Lake City." The keys of the officer's antiquated computer clicked noisily in the silent office as he wrote something. "You've been driving this route for how long?" "Approximately 8 years, on a regular basis." "Have you had odd dreams, memory lapses, or changes in your sleep patterns?" Brian was surprised at the strange inquiries. No DoD officer had ever inquired about his sleep or nightmares during a regular inspection in his 15 years of truck driving. "No, such kind of thing doesn't exist." "Is there an issue with my documentation?" The cop kept typing on his computer without responding. Brian could see glimmers of what looked to be a complicated form with hundreds of fields, much more intricate than any dot inspection form he had ever seen, even if the screen was tilted away from him. "Have you ever lost time while operating a motor vehicle?" "There are times when you are unable to recall how you got from one place to another." "These are what kind of questions?" "All I have to do is weigh my vehicle and go on to Salt Lake City." Brian saw something unsettling in the officer's gaze when he looked up for the first time. They were all black. There was no pupil or iris, only solid black spheres that appeared to absorb light instead of reflect it. "Mister, kindly respond to the inquiries." "Matthews." A shiver went down Brian's back. The man hadn't glanced closely enough at his driver's license or registration to read it, and he hadn't provided the officer his name. "How do you know my name?" The officer said, "It's on your paperwork." However, Brian could see his papers on the counter, unopened. When Brian turned to look around the office, he saw that the other drivers who had been there when he got there had left. The office felt a lot bigger than it had when he had first walked in, and he was alone with the odd officer. The fluorescent lights were going out, and the walls appeared to go on forever into the night. Brian reached for his documents and remarked, "I believe there has been an error. I must return to the path." With unnatural quickness, the officer's hand sprang out and grabbed Brian's wrist. The hold felt unbelievably firm and icy. "The examination is not finished. We must inspect your goods." Brian attempted to get free, but the officer's hold became more firm. "My cargo, only computers are involved. All of them are sealed and documented." The officer continued, "Not that cargo," his voice sounding more electronic as though it were being processed by a synthesizer of some sort. "The goods you are unaware you are transporting." After escaping the officer's hold, Brian dashed for the door. However, he was in a lengthy hallway with metal doors when he arrived at what ought to have been the exit. Behind him, the hallway extended into the night in both ways with no indication of the exit. Brian could hear the officer's footsteps, but they didn't sound like shoe leather. Instead, they sounded like metal clicking against concrete. Brian tried every door as he hurried down the hallway, but they were all shut. The sound of buzzing equipment accompanied the approaching footsteps. Close to his truck. Rather, he was in a different room with surveillance gear. Highways from above are displayed on dozens of screens, with each vehicle marked and followed. Some of the roads were ones Brian knew well from his frequent travels. One of the monitors had a white-coated professional looking up. His eyes were as black as the officer's. Speaking over a headset microphone, Subject 447 stated that he was now aware of the monitoring procedure. "Subject 447? What are you talking about?" Brian said. The technician indicated that Interstate 84 was displayed on one of the displays. Data was pouring across the screen, and a tracking indication indicated a silver truck. Brian was unable to understand the locations, speed, travel history, and dozens of other information. The technician, echoing the officer's impersonal tone, added, "Your truck has been outfitted with monitoring devices for the past 3 years. Every route you drive, every stop you make, every conversation you have is recorded and analyzed." Brian gazed at his truck on the screen. The data showed implausible readings, negative fuel use, speeds greater than any truck could reach, and locations that included coordinates for areas that shouldn't have been, even though the display indicated that the vehicle was currently parked at the way station. "This is crazy," Brian remarked. "People cannot just be watched without their permission. This is against the law." The consent was, the technician said, obtained through your participation in the highway system. You consent to being monitored for national security reasons each time you drive on an interstate route. Brian made an effort to comprehend what he was hearing. Security of the nation? I move furniture and computer equipment. Could there possibly be a national security interest in keeping an eye on me? The technician returned his attention to his screens. Some cargo moves by itself. Certain routes are only available when required. There are drivers who transport people they never see. There are other uses for the highway system besides transportation. Brian noticed something on one of the televisions that chilled him to the bone. With a clear view of the driver's seat, the monitor displayed the interior of his truck's cab. However, there was a stranger in the passenger seat that Brian had never seen before. A dark-clothed individual with shadows hiding their face. "Who is that?" Brian insisted. "Your travel companion. It has been traveling with you for around 18 months. The majority of drivers under surveillance are not aware of their passengers." Brian recalled the DOT officer's inquiries concerning lost time and memory gaps. There had been times during the last year and a half when he had been unable to recall parts of his drives. Highway stretches that appeared to go by quickly. Rest breaks he didn't remember going to. Dreamlike conversations on the CB radio. "What is it seeking?" "How come it's in my truck?" According to the technician, such information is classified above your clearance level. Kindly head back to your car and carry on with your journey. As planned, the surveillance will continue. In a desperate attempt to find a way out of the impossibly large institution, Brian fled the room. He discovered himself in a labyrinth of hallways and rooms containing unfamiliar equipment. Gadgets that didn't look like they belonged in a highway way station, but rather in a science fiction film. At last, Brian followed a sign indicating the vehicle departure down a lengthy ramp. His truck was parked just where he had left it as he exited into what seemed to be the typical way station parking area. However, the building surrounding him appeared to be newer, brighter, and equipped with contemporary machinery and regular-looking DOT officers handling other trucks. Brian cautiously walked over to his truck and peered through the passenger window. He could see a small depression in the cushion, suggesting that someone had been sitting there, even though the seat looked vacant. He got into the taxi and left the way station right away, continuing to drive until he came to a truck stop. 50 kilometers down the road, Brian conducted a thorough inspection of his truck at the truck stop, searching for any indications of tampering or surveillance equipment. He didn't find anything immediately apparent, but he did find that his GPS displayed recent locations he didn't recall going to, and that his CB radio had been adjusted to channels he had never used. When Brian described the way station to the Department of Transportation, officials informed him that there was no such facility at that position on Interstate 84. The closest way station, according to their records, was more than 100 kilometers away and had been closed for renovations when Brian claimed to have been there. Despite finishing his delivery to Salt Lake City, Brian couldn't get rid of the sensation that someone was watching him. During his drives over the next few weeks, he observed odd details. Rest spots with unfamiliar equipment, cars that appeared to follow him for oddly long distances, and CB radio's chats that, when he attempted to join them, abruptly ended. The memory gaps, which appeared to be worsening, were the most unsettling. With no recollection of the time that had passed, Brian would begin traveling along a well-known stretch of highway and end up hundreds of kilometers further along his path. His logbooks revealed stops at establishments he had never heard of, along with entries he couldn't recall making. In the end, Brian quit long-haul trucking and chose to avoid the interstate highways by taking a local delivery job. He continued to look up comparable experiences online, but he never again came with the enigmatic way station. He discovered sporadic accounts from drivers of similar experiences, way stations that were not shown on maps, black-eyed officers who asked odd questions, and monitoring devices that appeared to be much too sophisticated for standard commercial vehicle examinations. The most unsettling finding was a driver's forum post claiming to have installed surveillance devices in commercial trucks while working for a government contractor. The report claimed that thousands of trucks were outfitted with gadgets that could do far more than measure speed and position. They captured talks, tracked the driver's biometric information, and even used subsonic frequencies to control behavior. The truth of what transpired at the non-existent way station was never revealed to Brian. However, he is aware that the highway system in America conceals amenities and uses that are considerably more extensive than the general public is aware of. Additionally, some of the trucks that share the road with regular vehicles are transporting goods, as well as travelers who live in the shadows between the official world and a completely different one. In November 2022, Steve Chen took on a hurried delivery from Memphis to Atlanta and learned that certain routes have memory. He was forced to relive the last moments of drivers who never made it home as what began as overtime compensation for driving a road he had never been on before, turned into a journey through the echoes of traffic, accidents that occurred decades before. For 8 years, Steve had been a regional driver. Years, primarily well-traveled paths in Kentucky and Tennessee. However, he was unable to turn down his dispatcher's offer of double compensation to cover an impromptu delivery on Interstate 78 through Alabama. The money was too much to refuse, even though the route would pass through some of the most isolated parts of the Southern Highway. Around midnight, Steve was traveling through a particularly barren section of I-78 close to the Georgia-Alabama line when the issue began. He started to hear what sounded like emergency communications on his CB radio. Dispatchers arranging rescue vehicles, terrified people requesting assistance, and the controlled chaos of disaster response. However, Steve noticed that his pickup was the only vehicle on the roadway. Unit 47 is this. At mile marker 156, we have a multi-vehicle collision, requesting fire and ambulance assistance. A distinct voice came over his radio. Steve looked around. He was getting close to mile marker 156. However, there was absolutely no traffic, no emergency vehicles, and no accidents. The moonlight was dark, and the highway was vacant in both directions. Does anyone have a copy of that emergency traffic? Steve summoned his CB. This is significant. On 78 Steve bound. There appears to be no accident at marker 156. Quiet. Then another voice answered. This is Rescue Command, Big Steve. How old are you? I'm on I-78, heading east at mile marker 156. It appears that everything is clear here. No, Big Steve, there are no emergency units visible there. Are you certain where you are? Steve's radio continued to squawk about the emergency, but he was sure of his position. There was a steady flow of urgent communications concerning an event that didn't exist. Fire crews calling for heavy rescue equipment, paramedics demanding life flight helicopters. At mile marker 156, Steve's radio traffic abruptly stopped. Not even the static or far-off chatter that usually fills the airways on most highways could be heard on the CB. Steve attempted to call additional trucks, but received no answer. It appeared as though all of the nearby radios had been turned off at once. The emergency talk resumed 10 kilometers down the route. Although the voices were different this time, the information was the same. A serious collision, numerous fatalities, and emergency vehicles racing to the scene. Mile marker 162 was the precise spot where Steve was coming. But once more, there was no mishap when Steve arrived at the designated spot. The highway was deserted, with no recent collisions marking the surface. However, the radio kept transmitting in-depth emergency messages about people stuck in cars, incoming medical helicopters, and a traffic ban that was obviously not in place. At the next rest stop, Steve pulled over and listened to what he could hear. He looked through his phone's emergency frequencies and found something unsettling. The frequency on which the radio traffic he was receiving was transmitted had been shut off years before. The communication methods and call signs date back to the early 2000s and 1990s. When Steve looked up accident histories on I-78 around mile marker 156, he discovered something even more disturbing. In 1998, a multi-vehicle accident had resulted in fatalities. It was just the kind of accident he had heard in the radio chatter. A comparable incident had happened in 2003 at mile marker 162, with information indicating corresponded to the second emergency communications set. Both incidents, according to press sources, had necessitated intensive emergency response efforts and had resulted in several fatalities. Steve could hear what seemed like recordings or echoes of the actual emergency communications from those crashes on the radio. Decades later, it's still being transmitted somehow. Steve kept driving, and the pattern kept happening every few kilometers. At certain mile markers, his radio would pick up emergency talk about catastrophes that had occurred years or decades earlier. Steve was able to confirm the historical accuracy of each set of communications by consulting internet accident records and news archives, which described actual crashes. The psychological effects were profound. Steve listened to emergency personnel's last minutes as they attempted to save lives that had been lost years earlier, feeling as though he was driving through a cemetery of highway tragedies. He had traveled this path before. Unaware that their efforts had already made history, the voices on the radio were full of hope and urgency. A recognizable voice crackled on the radio around mile marker 178. "Big Steve in the blue Peterbilt is here to ask for help right now. I'm stuck in the cab of my truck after it jackknifed. Can I be heard?" Steve's heart froze. He was driving normally and without any issues, yet that was his own voice requesting assistance. Despite his desperate search, he failed to spot any additional trucks, accidents, or indications of danger. His own voice, however, persisted in voicing a frantic call for help. "This is Highway Patrol, Big Steve. We're headed over to where you are. Could you explain your wounds?" "I think my legs are pinned," he said in his own voice. "The engine is generating smoke. I need assistance now." Steve checked his CB radio as he pulled over and got out of his pickup. The gadget was receiving the transmissions and operating normally, yet not airing them. He could, however, plainly hear his own voice carrying on the emergency conversation, describing a crash that was not occurring and injuries he did not have. Steve couldn't find any recent accident reports near milepoint 178 on the internet. However, when searching through old local newspaper news articles, he came across something that caused him to doubt his sanity. Stephen Chen, a truck driver, lost his life in a jackknife accident at mile mark in 2019 on I-78, 178. Before rescue workers could extricate him, the driver had perished while stuck in his taxi. One passage from the emergency radio transcripts was quoted in the news broadcast. "Big Steve in the blue Peterbilt is here to ask for help right now. I'm stuck in the cab of my truck after it was jackknifed." Steve gazed intently at the newscast on his mobile device. Stephen Chen, who shares his last name, CB handle, and even truck description. However, Steve had never driven this route before the accident, which occurred 3 years prior. He was also still very much alive. Steve attempted to report the problem by calling his dispatcher, but there was no signal on his phone in the far-off place. He went back to his truck and drove on, intending to arrive at a mobile tower and seek assistance in comprehending the situation. But the radio persisted in transmitting emergency messages from his own impending demise. "Fire rescue is on the scene, Big Steve. We will remove you from that place." "I no longer feel my legs. The smoke is becoming more dense." "Big Steve, keep going." More dense. "Big Steve, keep going." Had never discussed an accident that had not affected him. When the rescue personnel realized they were losing the race against time to save a driver who shared his name and call sign, their voices became more desperate. The voice of a paramedic concluded the transmission. "Death time, 2:47 a.m. M." Steve checked his watch. 2:47 a.m. Steve had a weird detachment from reality at that moment. Was he on the road to Atlanta, still alive? Or if he had passed away in 2019 and was feeling a reverberation of his own mishap? Was he caught in some sort of chronological loop? Or was the roadway replaying records of past tragedies? To make sure he was still alive and cognizant, Steve squeezed himself, felt his pulse, and even smacked his face. It all seemed genuine. The chilly night air through his cracked window, the engine's vibration, and the steering wheel in his hands. However, the radio had just accurately reported his death, citing incidents that had allegedly occurred years prior. Steve's radio detected a fresh batch of emergency communications as he got closer to mile marker 185. They were talking about a different kind of disaster this time, a car that had collided with a deer and slid into a ditch. The emails detailed the rescue of the driver, a woman called Sarah. When Steve looked for accident records there, he discovered a 2001 news piece that detailed the precise situation. As stated in the radio transmission, Sarah Martinez was killed around mile marker 185 when her vehicle collided with a deer. Steve became aware that I-78 was automatically recording and repeating all of the emergency messages from all of the deadly accidents that had ever happened. The highway had turned into a storehouse of last moments along its length, transmitting the frantic attempts to save lives that had already been lost. However, his own demise was distinct. Steve was still alive and operating a motor vehicle. However, emergency was being played on the freeway. Communications from a 2019 accident that allegedly claimed the life of a person with his precise identity and circumstances. Did the highway foretell horrors to come? Or has Stephen Chen changed completely in 2019? Steve never came up with a good response. He never drove I-78 again after completing his delivery to Atlanta. He investigated There was simply a brief obituary without a photo for Stephen Chen, a truck driver who passed away in 2019 and had no family or background information included. Steve tried to forget the incident by changing his CB handle, but he was never able to. He occasionally ponders whether roadways around the world are documenting the last moments of drivers who fail to reach their homes late at night while he's traveling other routes. And he questions whether his voice is still requesting assistance on I-78 in an accident that occurred 3 years prior to his visit, or if he is still waiting to occur to him later on. Steve learned from the event that certain roads retain the memories of everything that occurs on them, preserving the echoes of human misery in ways that are inexplicable. Events that haven't yet occurred, or that happened to a person with your name but may not have existed at all, are occasionally included in those echoes. When Eddie Rodriguez pulled into what seemed like a typical travel center on Highway 285 in New Mexico during a blizzard in January 2023, he learned that some truck stops exist in pockets of time that don't move forward. In the real world, what he had anticipated as a little coffee break and fuel stop turned into a 12-hour nightmare that lasted only 20 minutes. During one of the worst winter storms he had ever experienced in his 19 years of driving, Eddie was transporting frozen products from Albuquerque to Denver. His fuel gauge was almost empty and visibility was almost zero when he noticed the unmistakable glow of a truck stop up ahead. Desert Springs Travel Center, fuel, food, lodging, the sign said. Despite traveling this road every month for more than 10 years, Eddie had never before seen this location. Given the hazardous weather, Eddie was startled to see that the parking lot was almost full. Instead of continuing to drive in such conditions, the majority of prudent drivers would have sought refuge hours ago. But seeing other trucks made Eddie happy. It indicated that the facility was operating and open. Fighting the wind and snow, Eddie parked beside a red Freightliner and made his way to the main building. The travel center appeared normal from the inside. There was a small restaurant area, shelves filled with trucker supplies and snacks, bright fluorescent lighting, and a counter where a middle-aged woman was selling coffee to a number of drivers. However, there was something strange about the location. Though the truckers seated at the restaurant tables appeared to be beyond their usual level of road tiredness, they strolled slowly, whispered to each other, and continued to check their watches while wearing increasingly anxious looks. An artificial smile never made it to the woman behind the counter. Eddie went to the counter and got a cup of coffee. "Terrible weather out there," he informed her. "Yes," she said in a flat, "it's been like this for quite some time." Voice in monotone. "What is the duration of your stay?" "Just long enough to get some food and fuel. In half an hour we should be back on the road." The woman smiled momentarily. "It could be longer than that, I'm afraid." Eddie covered the cost of his coffee and walked to where a few of drivers were seated in the restaurant area. One of them he knew. He had met Mike Santos, a driver at several truck stops over the years. "What are you doing here, Mike? I assumed you were now solely in charge of the West Coast." Mike's eyes were tired and hollow when he looked up. "When did you arrive here, Eddie?" "Right now." "You've been here for how long?" With a look of bewilderment on his face, Mike checked his watch. "I don't know. At about 8 p.m., I pulled over for gas. However, according to my watch, it is still 8:15. That isn't possible." Eddie checked his own timepiece. 8:17 p.m. Even though he had been in the travel center for at least 10 minutes, Mike claimed that only 2 minutes had gone by since his arrival at 8 p.m. "Perhaps your watch stopped," Eddie said. "I had that thought. However, take a peek around. The time on everyone's watch is the same." At neighboring tables, Eddie urged the other drivers to look at their timepieces. Every clock device, including watches, phones, and truck dashboard clocks, displayed times ranging from 8:15 to 8:20 p.m. However, According to the drivers themselves, they spent hours at the travel center. An old man named Frank, one of the drivers, claimed to have been there since the early afternoon. I paused at 2 p.m. for lunch. However, 2:15 is still displayed on my watch. Since then, I've tried sleeping in my truck, eaten 3 meals, and taken dozens of walks around the structure. However, time isn't passing. Eddie was shown her logbook by a younger driver named Lisa. Her data indicate that she had been at the travel center for more than 8 hours, recording several meals, rest times, and fuel stops. However, the electronic tracking system on her truck indicated that she had only been there for 15 minutes. It was not the weather outside that made Eddie feel cold. Has anyone attempted to depart? The drivers looked at each other anxiously. Frank raised his voice. Despite our best efforts, something always manages to pull us back. Trucks refuse to start. Roads are closed, or we simply return here unable to recall how. Eddie made the decision to investigate this further. His keys were missing from his pocket as he went outside to his truck. He looked everywhere, in his cab, on the ground near the vehicle, and even on his way back to the building. The keys have just disappeared. Eddie asked the woman behind the counter in the travel center if anyone had returned any misplaced keys. She flashed that same fake smile. Regretfully, until things get better, all cars must stay parked. Under what circumstances? It's only snow. This isn't the worst weather I've drove in. She said to time conditions, as though that clarification made it makes great sense. Eddie attempted to call for assistance using his cell phone, which typically has decent service in this location, but the gadget displayed no signal. The issue was noted by the other drivers as well. Other than making calls and using the internet, their phones functioned as intended. Eddie started to notice unsettling things as he spent more time in the travel center. No matter how much the drivers ate, the restaurant's food never ran out. The coffee pot was never empty. The coffee pot was never empty. The ice cream freezer was always well supplied, and the number of hot dogs on the roller grill never went down. The woman behind the desk didn't appear to take breaks, eat, or drink. Hours passed while she continued to serve clients with the same robotic grin. When Eddie attempted to converse with her regarding, she would reply with non sequiturs or just restate earlier assertions if it wasn't the travel center. What happened when drivers attempted to sleep was the most unsettling. Frank had made several attempts to sleep in his truck, but each time he awoke, he found himself back inside the building, unable to recall how he had arrived. Other drivers that attempted to exit the main area experienced the same outcome. They would approach the exit and, in some way, discover themselves at the tables of the restaurants. Eddie made the decision to carry out an experiment. He requested that all drivers set their timepieces to 8:30 p.m., then see what transpired over the course of the following hour. Together they sat in the dining area, keeping track of their timepieces and recording all they encountered. Their watches told them that an hour had gone by. They conversed, played games, ate meals, and even watched a movie on the TravelSense TV. However, they all still displayed 9:30 p.m. when they checked their watches once more. Even though time had stopped passing, they could still feel the length of time and the order of events. Lisa had tried to explain what might be going on, having a background in physics before becoming a truck driver. We seem to be in a time bubble. Subjectively, time is passing. We're growing older, thinking, and living. However, objective time is not progressing. The same 20-minute interval keeps repeating, and we're locked in a loop. However, why? Eddie inquired. Why are we still here? Frank had a hypothesis. For however long I've actually been here, I've been considering this. When I traveled this route last month, there was no travel center. This section of the roadway is one I recall. Nothing was present but the desert. Nothing, no exits, no buildings. Eddie understood that Frank was correct. Before tonight, he had never seen this travel center in his years of monthly driving Highway 285. But now, with its weathered pavement and old lettering that suggested decades of use, it appeared to have existed forever. Mike noticed something else unsettling. Take a look at the other clients. As Eddie scanned the travel center, he discovered something he had never seen before. There were other persons in the building besides the drivers at the restaurant tables. Customers perusing the aisles, elderly couples, and families with kids. However, these individuals never made purchases, never talked, and never appeared to notice the driver. Eddie attempted to speak with one of these phantom clients would appear to ignore him as they moved away. Although they were genuine and solid, they were just there in the room, not interacting with anyone or anything. They filled the scene but had no purpose, much like the supporting cast in a play. Eddie started to believe that the travel center was a trap of some sort set up to catch people traveling in hazardous weather. But why? Neither government officials nor criminals appeared to be operating the facility. It was more akin to a world that lived outside of everyday reality and followed laws that were incomprehensible to humans. Something changed about midnight, according to Eddie's internal clock. The temperature in the travel center significantly decreased and the lights started to flicker. The phantom clients began to move, more unpredictably, standing still for extended periods of time or walking in circles. At last, the smile on the woman's face behind the counter vanished, to be replaced by a look of robotic focus. On a computer that Eddie was positive had never been there before, she started typing. Frank took hold of Eddie's arm and began to enter data at an unhuman pace. This has previously occurred. Something resets every couple of hours. The phantoms vanish. The woman uses that computer for any purpose she has in mind. After that, everything is restarted with new phantom clients. How does the reset affect us? Everything else changes, but we remain conscious. It's similar to repeatedly seeing the same film, except we can recall every previous showing. The spectral clients started to fade away like ghosts while Eddie watched, turning translucent and then completely vanishing. With a no longer human expression, the woman gazed up at the drivers after finishing her typing. Her shark-like eyes had turned completely black. Her voice reverberated throughout the building as she declared, "Reset initiated. Keep an eye out for a time adjustment." For precisely 3 seconds, the lights were out. A whole new group of phantom customers filled the travel center as they turned back on. The clocks had all been reset to 8 quag, and the woman had returned to her fake smile. However, something was different this time. In his pocket, Eddie discovered his truck keys. The snowstorm had ceased, and his truck started up normally when he stepped outdoors. Eddie could see regular traffic in the distance, and the roadway was clear. Eddie made no hesitation. As quickly as he could, he got into his pickup and left the travel center. He could see the lights of the skyscraper fading into the distance in his rearview mirror. It was 8:23 p.m. when he checked his dashboard clock, just 3 minutes after his initial arrival. After finishing his delivery to Denver, Eddie looked up the Desert Springs Travel Center right away. Based on internet maps and business directories, Highway 285 does not have such a feature. Where he had halted, the GPS coordinates revealed nothing but barren desert, with no indication of any business development. There was no sign of the other drivers Eddie had met at the travel center, so he attempted to get in touch with them. In trucking company files, Mike Santos, Frank, and Lisa seemed to be truckers who had disappeared during winter storms in previous years. The drivers themselves were never found, but their trucks had been discovered abandoned on several roadways. Eddie came to the realization that he had fled from a place that gathered lost travelers and fed off their time and experiences while locking them in temporal cycles. The phantom patrons were most likely former victims who had been totally engrossed in whatever power ran the establishment. However, Eddie didn't immediately see the repercussions of his escape. He started to have odd side effects from his stay at the Desert Springs Travel Center during the next few weeks. It appeared that his internal clock was irreparably broken. He would think he'd taken a little nap and wake up to realize he'd lost an entire day, or he'd feel like he'd been driving for hours only to find that minutes had passed. The temporal echoes were even more unsettling. At other truck stops, Eddie would get a glimpse of the travel center. The typical facility would flicker and display the Desert Springs layout in brief flashes. For a few seconds, the woman with the fake smile would emerge behind counters before being replaced by regular staff members who didn't seem to notice. Dr. Margaret Chen, a retired physicist who had published articles on missing time episodes and temporal anomalies, was approached by Eddie. As Eddie talked about his experience, Dr. Chen disclosed that she had been recording incidents like this for more than 20 years. During their phone discussion, Dr. Chen said, "You're describing what we call a temporal sinkhole, locations where time eddies and pools rather than flowing freely. When electromagnetic fields are disturbed during severe weather occurrences, they appear." Dr. Chen has records on scores of missing passengers whose cars were located after they were last seen during storms. Days later, with electronic issues and enigmatic gasoline use patterns. Although their trucks' computerized logs merely recorded hours of operation, some had been missing for weeks. The drivers who escape these temporal sinkholes but bring something back with them are the really disturbing cases, Dr. Chen added. Drivers are unable to see or recall passengers who appear on surveillance cameras. Eddie got cold. He requested more explanations from Dr. Chen. If your truck has cabin cameras, check them out. Keep an eye out for any indications that you are not alone in the taxi, such as shadows that don't correspond with your position or reflections that reveal more passengers. Eddie watched the security footage of his truck from the previous month that evening. What he discovered led him to contemplate giving up trucking completely. His passenger seat was occupied by a shadowy figure in dozens of recordings, the same kind of phantom client he had encountered at the Desert Springs Travel Center. Even though Eddie had no recollection of talking to any of the other passengers, the figure seemed to be watching him and occasionally leaned forward as if conversing. Worst of all, the shadow appeared to be becoming more tangible every day, as though it were gradually becoming a literal reality. Eddie dialed Dr. Chen, returned, and explained what he had discovered. She gave a somber reaction. One of them has returned with you. Occasionally, escapees become attached to the temporal entities that operate these institutions. They want to live in normal time by using you as an anchor. According to Dr. Chen, these shadow travelers would progressively deplete their host's vitality while growing more actual themselves. The host would eventually disappear when the entity fully replaced them, identity, recollections, and even physical attributes. Dr. Chen stated that although there are methods to break the connection, they are risky and not always effective. When the thing understands what you're attempting to achieve, it will fight back. The procedure, Dr. Chen explained that it entailed going back to the precise location where Eddie had experienced the temporal aberration and carrying out a ceremony intended to break the link. However, doing so would require purposefully looking for the Desert Springs Travel Center during another storm, running the risk of becoming permanently stuck once more. Eddie had an alternative. He could live with the shadow passenger and gradually disappear over the course of several months until the creature took his place entirely. According to Dr. Chen, he might have 6 weeks left before the change would be permanent. Eddie decided to defend himself. He waited for another powerful storm to hit the Highway 285 corridor for 3 weeks, tracking weather patterns throughout New Mexico. When forecasters said there would be a significant blizzard in the area, Eddie packed his truck with supplies and headed in the direction of where he had first seen the travel center. With visibility close to zero and hazardous wind conditions, the storm was worse than the last one. However, Eddie was resolved to track down the Desert Springs Travel Center and face the monster that was gradually robbing him of his identity. The travel center showed up at the peak of the storm, as predicted, shining through the snow, just as it had previously. But Eddie was ready this time. Observing Dr. Chen's guidance, he brought an apparatus that produced certain electromagnetic frequencies and a set of mirrors intended to reflect temporal energy. Eddie discovered the identical scene inside the travel agency. Phantom consumers going about their daily lives, drivers caught in time loops, and the woman behind the counter with her fake grin. Eddie, however, could now also see the shadow passengers that were affixed to every stranded motorist, progressively taking their place as they fed off their time. Eddie was instantly recognized by the woman behind the counter. "You took unapproved equipment with you when you returned." A high-pitched electromagnetic wave filled the travel center as Eddie turned on Dr. Chen's equipment. As if waking from a deep dream, the captive drivers gazed around in confusion as the phantom clients started to flicker and fade. The woman continued, "You cannot break the temporal matrix," in an electronic, distorted voice. "The entities need their manifestation cycle to be finished." Eddie created feedback loops that interfered with the facility's ability to function by using the mirrors to reroute the temporal energy passing through the structure. The clock started whirling rapidly through the various periods, and lights started strobing, but Eddie's shadow passenger struggled to take complete control of his body. As it attempted to finish its control, Eddie felt his consciousness being pushed aside. For a few horrifying minutes, Eddie felt his own memories and feelings superimposed on those of the shadow passenger, a creature that had spent decades stuck in time loops and longed to return to linear time. Eddie fought to maintain control over his identity until the electromagnetic pulse hit a critical frequency. All of the facility's entities were abruptly ejected back to their original dimensions when the temporal matrix ruptured. Eddie was by himself in the travel center, which was now rapidly deteriorating. In a matter of minutes, the edifice aged decades. Furniture is collapsing, paint is peeling, and fixtures are corroding. The facility fell behind Eddie as he rushed to his pickup and sped off. The shadow traveler had vanished by the time Eddie examined his security cameras. Although Dr. Chen acknowledged that the electromagnetic pulse had effectively broken the connection, He cautioned that Eddie might still be affected for months. Eddie did have odd symptoms, including dreams in which he was still caught in the temporal loop, glimpses of the travel center superimposed over regular truck stops, and sporadic time lapses in which he would lose minutes or hours. However, these effects subsided after time. Eddie always made careful to fill up before heading into isolated locations, and he never drove Highway 285 by himself again. He occasionally questions whether the Desert Springs Travel Center is still open and waiting for the next storm to bring in new clients who will realize that there are places on America's highways where time doesn't move normally, where minutes seem to go on forever and seconds seem to fly by. However, he now understands that fleeing such locations is just the first step toward danger, and that some people follow long after you believe you've arrived in safety. You return home. You return home. When Carlos Mendy's GPS failed during a delivery journey from Phoenix to El Paso in April 2022, he discovered that not all roads lead somewhere. What began as a straightforward diversion to avoid construction turned into a trip down an interstate highway segment that is present on all maps yet leads to locations that shouldn't be accessible in the American Southwest. Carlos was a little ahead of time on Interstate 10 as he hauled auto parts in his black Volvo truck. Electronic signs near Tucson warned of an impending big accident that would cause delays of several hours. State Route 86 south to Interstate 19 and then back to I-10 close to the Mexican border was the route Carlos's dispatcher suggested, a diversion that would only prolong his journey by 1 hour. However, Carlos noticed something odd when he followed his GPS onto what should have been Route 86. The surface of the road was ideal. Too ideal for a state roadway that usually saw a lot of trucks. The asphalt had no markings and was smooth. There were no cracks or potholes whatsoever, and the lane lines were a dazzling white. The scenery was more unsettling. Carlos was familiar with the landscape, having made numerous trips across southern Arizona. There are sporadic tiny towns, mountains, and desert scrub. However, the landscape surrounding this route appeared different. Even though Carlos was a native of the area, the desert was overly green and full of vegetation that he didn't identify. Carlos anticipated seeing signs for the Interstate 19 connector after 30 minutes of driving. Rather, a green highway sign caught his attention. It said 450 kilometers, Interstate 86 West, Las Vegas. After stopping, Carlos looked at his maps. He should have been traveling east toward I-19 rather than west toward Nevada, because Arizona did not have Interstate 86. Carlos attempted calling other truckers on his CB radio, but there was no sound at all. His GPS was still operational and verified that he was on Interstate 86 West, but his cell phone was dead, which wasn't unusual in isolated places. The device said that this highway indeed exists, and that it ran through a route Carlos had never heard of, connecting Arizona and Nevada. Carlos drove on, confused but unfrightened, hoping to find an exit where he might turn around or at least get directions. But for the following hour, he saw just a flawless highway extending over an impossibly difficult landscape. No buildings, no side roads, no exits. Around Interstate 86, the desert was Carlos had never seen anything like this before. Everything had an unusual blue-green tint that appeared to be caused by the plants themselves rather than atmospheric effects, as opposed to Arizona's usual brown and tan hues. Along the highway, the saguaro cactus seemed to be growing in perfectly straight lines and were taller than usual. At midday, Carlos noticed something that caused him to doubt his sanity. A city rose up from the desert floor in the distance. It wasn't a tiny hamlet or trade post, but a full-fledged metropolis with skyscrapers, expansive suburbs, and even during the day, what seemed like millions of lights. Carlos looked at his GPS, but it didn't display any cities in this region. Every map he had ever seen showed hundreds of kilometers in any direction of nothing but barren desert. However, in front of him was clearly an urban area bigger than Tucson or Phoenix. Carlos noticed an exit sign as he got closer to the city. There are 2.4 million people living in New Esperanza, the next 3 exits. Carlos had never heard of New Esperanza despite having spent his entire life in Arizona. A 2-person city. It would be hard to conceal or ignore the state's greatest population of 4 million. In an attempt to find someone who could tell him where he was and how to return to a familiar path, Carlos took the first exit. A surface street that appeared to belong in a major city was reached by the off-ramp. Professional signs, 6 lanes, and well-kept vegetation. However, as Carlos entered New Esperanza, he became aware that something was horribly incorrect. There were no cars, no people, no indications of life. The city seemed utterly deserted, not merely peaceful or sparsely populated. The structures looked to have been built lately and were undamaged. The streetlights were on. The landscape looked immaculate, and traffic signals were functioning as they should. However, no one was present anywhere. There were no automobiles in the parking lots, no people walking on the sidewalks, and no one moving behind the office building windows. After parking his pickup in front of what looked like a mall, Carlos got out to look around. He unlocked the mall's doors and discovered a fully functional establishment. A movie theater with the newest films on the marquee, shops filled with goods, and eateries serving fresh meals under heat lamps. However, there were no workers. Moreover, there was no proof that these facilities had ever been utilized. There was plenty of money in the cash registers. The items was neatly presented, and the meal was warm and fresh. The whole city seems to have been constructed and furnished for people who had never been there. Carlos tried a number of businesses' phones, but none of them had dial tones. Despite not being able to connect to the internet, the computers were operational. Even the ATMs worked, although they gave out money Carlos didn't recognize. Bills with images of presidents and sites he had never seen, but which appeared to be American currency. Carlos continued his exploration of the city outside the mall. All the buildings were open. All the facilities were up and running, but it was everything utterly deserted. He discovered schools with lesson plans written on blackboards, clinics with hygienic operation rooms and well-stocked medical supplies, and residential areas with homes that appeared to be occupied but were empty. The infrastructure of the city was the most unsettling. Everything went flawlessly: street lighting, water, electricity, and traffic control systems. However, there were no utility buildings of any type, no power plants, and no water treatment facilities. In some way, the city was operating without any obvious assistance. Carlos attempted to contact his dispatcher from other parts of the city, but his phone was still unreliable. All the exit ramps headed back into the city, so he went back to his truck and tried to get out of New Esperanza. He found himself driving in circles through the same deserted streets, regardless of which way he went. Carlos grew more and more frantic as night fell. Every petrol station in New Esperanza was open and supplied, but he had been driving for hours and was running low on fuel. Because there were no other customers or staff around, the transactions appeared unreal even though the pumps took his credit card and dispensed fuel as usual. Carlos slept in his pickup parked outside a hotel that night. Even though the building was completely furnished and unlocked, Carlos couldn't bear to sleep in a place that felt so essentially incorrect. He listened to the uncanny quiet of a metropolis built for millions but inhabited by none, while keeping his truck running and his doors shut. Carlos came to a startling realization the following morning. All of the establishments he had visited the day before had been refilled during the night. The food he had consumed from buffets at restaurants had been swapped out. The items he had relocated had been put back where they belonged, and the station's tanks had somehow been refilled with the gas he pumped. Carlos started to believe that New Esperanza was a test facility or trap of some sort, but why? The city was too flawless to be a movie set, too costly and ornate to be a government experiment, and too real to be a hallucination. Carlos observed a new phenomenon on his second day in the city. The patterns of the traffic lights had started to change in response to his movements. The light would change to green as he got closer to an intersection. The relevant arrow would light up when he intended to turn. The infrastructure of the city seemed to be reacting to his presence. Additionally, Carlos found that the city was far bigger than it had looked from the highway. He had traveled more than 200 kilometers through the streets of New Esperanza, according to the odometer on his truck. He had only begun to explore the urban region, though. With new neighborhoods and business districts popping up everywhere, the city appeared to go on forever. Each and every corner. Carlos discovered something that almost drove him insane on the third day. He found a building directory indicating the location of the Interstate 86 monitoring station on floor 47 in the city's central business sector. After riding the elevator to the 47th floor, Carlos arrived to a building with numerous monitors that displayed different routes of Interstate 86. Real-time video of the highway Carlos had been traveling on, including his own truck in New Esperanza, was shown on the displays. However, they also displayed dozens of more cars dispersed throughout various Interstate 86 segments. Motorcyclists, trucks, and cars all seemed to be lost on the same unattainable roadway. On one monitor, a family in an RV looked to have been living off of supplies from deserted towns like New Esperanza, while cruising Interstate 86 for weeks. A fleet of military vehicles appeared on another screen, seemingly looking for an exit that was not there. Carlos recognized the trap that was Interstate 86, that kidnapped tourists and dumped them in deserted cities around the American Southwest. The highway was located in another universe or parallel realm where people never lived, but infrastructure was constructed. Carlos found the exit on his fourth day in New Esperanza. He discovered a straightforward dirt road that returned to the desert while investigating the city's outskirts. There were no on-ramps or signs, simply a hole in the city's perimeter that led onto well-known scenery of Arizona. After navigating the gap, Carlos returned to the official routes in Arizona. Right away, his GPS recalculated and displayed his precise location on State Route 86 close to Tucson. The clock on his truck indicated that he had only been on the detour for 4 hours. Even though Carlos finished his delivery to El Paso after what seemed like 4 days in New Esperanza, he couldn't quit thinking about it. He looked into Interstate 86, but he couldn't find any formal documentation of it in Arizona. However, he found online discussion boards where other tourists shared comparable experiences. Roads that arose while taking detours, cities that were built but never inhabited, and infrastructure that functioned without any obvious assistance. Carlos altered his driving style, but he never again came across Interstate 86. Forever. He no longer follows the deviations that GPS systems suggest. When driving, he constantly keeps in touch with his dispatcher every hour and keeps paper maps on hand as a backup, traversing isolated regions. Occasionally, while Carlos is traveling across Arizona, he looks for the blue-green glimmer of impossibly lush vegetation in the desert at night. The lights of cities in the distance that shouldn't be there. He is aware that someplace Interstate 86 continues to ensnare travelers and direct them to locations that are situated between reality and the contemporary infrastructure America.